In the quiet and picturesque town of Boulder, Colorado, the morning began as usual, with a light breeze running between the houses and the first rays of sunlight softly touching the roofs. Life flowed smoothly and calmly until the silence was broken by a call to the police station at about 8 in the morning. On the other end of the line was the alarmed voice of Lisa Martin's neighbor, Sarah Gibson. She reported strange screams that she heard from Lisa's house the night before. The screams were short, but so sharp and panicked that Sarah could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The patrol officer who received the call went to the scene. Arriving at Lisa's house, he noticed that the front door was slightly open. There was a dead silence inside, and the faint smell of fresh paint filled the air, which was unusual for this neat and clean house. The officer cautiously walked inside, suspecting something was wrong. The first thing he saw was a picture of absolute chaos in the living room. The furniture was overturned and several broken photo frames lay on the floor. The officer called, but no one answered. He headed towards the stairs leading to the second floor. As he stood up, he felt a strange sensation of cold running down his back, and at the same time caught a smell that could indicate something terrible. Entering the bedroom, the officer stopped in a daze. On the bed, covered with a white sheet, lay the body of a young girl, apparently dead. The face was distorted in a terrible grimace, and her eyes were wide open, as if at the moment of death she had seen something terrible. The blood caked on the sheets indicated that death had occurred some time ago. But what caused the greatest surprise to the officer was that there were no signs of a struggle near the body, as if the victim knew his killer and did not expect an attack. At this time, Detective James O'Reilly and his team arrived on the scene. O'Reilly, a man with 10 years of experience in criminal investigation, immediately realized that this case would not be easy. He began by examining the crime scene, paying attention to every detail. The location of the body, marks on the floor, strange stains on the walls. Everything indicated that this murder was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned crime. During the initial examination, the detective noticed a diary on the nightstand next to the bed, which apparently belonged to the deceased. He carefully opened it and began to leaf through the pages on which the thoughts and feelings of the young girl were written. Some of the entries spoke of fears and anxieties that she could not tell anyone about. O'Reilly knew that this diary could be a clue to what really happened. Meanwhile, officers continued to investigate the house. In the bathroom, they found faint traces of blood on the floor and on the sink, indicating that the killer was trying to wash away traces of his crime. In the kitchen, they found a kitchen knife, thoroughly washed and put back in its place, but there were faint traces of blood on it, barely visible to the naked eye. This was the first significant piece of the puzzle that spoke of the premeditation of the murder. Detective O'Reilly decided to immediately begin questioning the neighbors. Sarah Gibson, who called the police, was first in line. She talked about the screams she heard and Lisa's strange behavior over the past few days. According to her, Lisa was nervous, which did not correspond to her usually calm and reserved character. Sarah also mentioned that Lisa and Emma had been fighting a lot lately. Although the reasons for these fights remained a mystery to her, the investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear that there was a long and difficult path ahead to uncover the truth. Detective O'Reilly knew that there were no small details in this case, and every detail could be decisive in finding the answer to the question, what really happened in this house, and who was capable of such a brutal crime? Detective James O'Reilly began carefully examining the evidence collected and interviewing witnesses. First of all, he decided to focus on Lisa and Emma's closest neighbors, because their testimony could shed light on the last days before the tragedy. He understood that any little thing could be the key to solving a murder, so he treated every interrogation with the utmost care. Sarah Gibson, a neighbor across the street, was once again the center of attention. O'Reilly invited her to a conversation at the police station, where the interrogation took place in a calm but tense atmosphere. Sarah was a middle-aged woman, always active and attentive to what was happening around her. She began her story by saying that Lisa and Emma had always seemed like a good couple to her, although at times the relationship between them seemed too tense. Sarah said that over the past few weeks she had increasingly noticed Lisa's strange behavior. The woman seemed worried and irritated, and often left the house late at night, which was unusual for her. She also mentioned that she saw Emma crying several times, but she quickly hid in the house, not wanting to communicate. They argued often, but I thought it was just the usual disagreements that happen between mother and daughter, Sarah said, pursing her lips. But behind this seemingly ordinary explanation, there was something more. The arguments Sarah heard through the walls became increasingly intense and loud. In recent days, I began to fear for Emma. Once I was even going to call the police, but I decided that it was none of my business. And now I regret it. Detective O'Reilly listened intently, making notes on his notepad. He understood that Sarah might not know all the details, but her observations already pointed to certain problems in the relationship between Lisa and Emma. He asked the question that had been on his tongue from the very beginning. Sarah, have you ever noticed anything unusual in their relationship? Maybe something that went beyond the usual family quarrels? Sarah fell silent, her eyes darting around the room as if she wasn't sure whether to speak further. Finally, she admitted, I always thought their relationship was too weird. They were closer than the average mother and daughter. Sometimes it seemed to me that there was something more in their relationship, something wrong. This hint made O'Reilly wary. He thanked Sarah for her cooperation and released her, but her words left many questions in his mind. If the relationship between Lisa and Emma really went beyond the usual family, then this could explain many of the oddities in their behavior. Next in line was Tom Ellison, Emma's friend and classmate. Tom, a young man with a keen mind and a vivid imagination, was always close to Emma. He came to the interrogation in a state of shock and depression, but was ready to help as much as possible. He began his story by describing what Emma was like in the last months before her death. She's changed, Tom said, nervously fiddling with the edge of his sleeve. She became withdrawn and began to avoid the company of friends. Even with me, her best friend, she no longer shared her experiences. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help her. Tom also said that Emma once mentioned that her relationship with Lisa was tense. He tried to find out what exactly was bothering Emma, but she refused to talk about it. She just said she couldn't stand it anymore, but I thought she was talking about some everyday nonsense. Now I understand that I was wrong, Tom admitted bitterly. O'Reilly was sure that this matter was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. He asked Tom to remember anything else that could help in the investigation. Tom thought for a moment, and after a short pause added, One day, Emma said that she found something on Lisa's computer that really scared her. She didn't specify what exactly, but I noticed that after that, her fear of Lisa only intensified. This information turned out to be extremely important. If Emma really found something incriminating, then this could be a motive for murder. O'Reilly decided that it was necessary to thoroughly examine Lisa's computer to find possible evidence. Meanwhile, the team of investigators continued to study Lisa and Emma's house. One of the officers responsible for collecting digital evidence discovered password-protected files on Lisa's computer. It turned out to be difficult to hack them, but after several hours of work, specialists managed to gain access to these documents. They contained personal letters from Lisa to Emma, filled with strange confessions and expressions of feelings that were not typical for her mother. These letters came as a real shock to investigators. They confirmed what neighbors and friends had only guessed. The relationship between Lisa and Emma really went beyond the normal. O'Reilly, realizing the gravity of these discoveries, realized that the situation was much more complex than it first appeared. He also knew that these letters could become key evidence against Lisa, but they had to be used with the utmost care so as not to ruin the investigation already underway. The further O'Reilly delved into the case, the more he realized that behind the mask of an ordinary family, there was a dark and dangerous secret. And now his main task was to find out how and why this secret led to tragedy. Everything pointed to the fact that Lisa could be involved in the murder of her adopted daughter, but the detective knew that one should not rush to conclusions. There was still a lot of work ahead and many questions that had to be answered. The investigation was gaining momentum. Detective O'Reilly's team worked tirelessly to gather as much evidence as possible that could shed light on the tragic events of that fateful night. Given the open letters, which became serious evidence for the investigation, it was decided to carefully examine all aspects of the lives of Lisa and Emma In order to understand how their relationship could lead to murder, the police sent Lisa's computer for additional examination to extract all possible information. The focus was on Lisa's personal correspondence, emails, and online inquiries over the past few months. Investigators discovered that Lisa was in active correspondence with several psychologists and even lawyers about foster relationships, but the further they dug, the more strange her requests became. Among the many ordinary messages, some very alarming moments stood out. Lisa's search history included queries related to how to cover up a crime and how to cover your tracks. These facts clearly indicated that she was preparing for a crime, but this was not enough to finally bring charges. It was important for O'Reilly to understand how these online requests were connected to what had happened in Lisa's home in recent months. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued to analyze physical evidence found at the crime scene. Particular attention was drawn to bloodstains found in the bathroom and on the kitchen knife. The lab confirmed it was Emma's blood, and marks on the sink indicated that someone had tried to wash the blood away after the murder. This prompted the investigation to conclude that the killer tried to hide his actions, but did not succeed completely. While examining the house, investigators also noticed one important detail: the disappearance of some of Emma's personal belongings. Clothes, books, some photographs disappeared without a trace. This could indicate an attempt to stage an escape, but the lack of logic in this version forced O'Reilly's team to look for other explanations. O'Reilly, being a systematic and scrupulous person, understood perfectly well that to solve the case, it was necessary to collect all the pieces of the puzzle. He focused his efforts on studying Lisa's financial history. By carefully reviewing her bank statements, detectives discovered that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Lisa had made several large transfers to closed accounts. These transfers looked suspicious because the amounts were atypical for her lifestyle. She had never been known to be a big spender, and such transactions seemed counterintuitive given her steady but modest income. In parallel with this analysis, detectives also took Lisa's personal belongings, including her clothes and shoes, for examination. Particularly eye-catching was a pair of sneakers that appeared to have been recently washed. Under a microscope, experts found tiny traces of blood on the soles, which were barely visible to the naked eye. This became another piece of evidence that increasingly linked Lisa with the murder. Key to the investigation was the discovery of Lisa's recent purchase of large amounts of household chemicals, including powerful cleaning products commonly used to remove biological traces. O'Reilly knew that this move was part of Lisa's attempts to cover her tracks, but the careful way she tried to do it showed that the crime was carefully thought out. Neighbors continued to provide information that gradually built a more complete picture of the relationship between Lisa and Emma. Many talked about frequent visits to Lisa by strange people whom no one could identify. Some of them claimed to have seen a young woman resembling Emma in the company of unknown men, raising the question, was there more to it than just a family quarrel? Meanwhile, Lisa remained at large because detectives did not want to act prematurely without all the necessary evidence. But O'Reilly felt the key was close. He began to focus on studying Lisa's psychological profile. It turned out that she had suffered from depression for a long time and had problems with anger control, as evidenced by her visits to psychotherapists. This could explain her actions, but did not remove the question of motives. Detectives also found out that on the day of the murder, Lisa was visiting a psychotherapist. This might have looked like part of her usual routine, if not for the fact that after the visit, she went for several hours in an unknown direction, which she did not mention during the first interrogation. This raised suspicions that Lisa might have planned her actions that day with cold prudence. The interrogations continued, and despite Lisa's efforts to remain calm and composed, her story began to fall apart. Detectives found more and more contradictions in her testimony, especially when it came to the last days of Emma's life. They learned that Lisa tried to control Emma's every move, monitoring her meetings and phone calls, which clearly indicated an unhealthy obsession. All these new discoveries gradually built up a picture of an elaborate crime, where Lisa's every action was aimed at concealing her true intentions. But now that the evidence was starting to converge, Detective O'Reilly felt he was on the right track. He had only one thing left to do: put all the fragments together and build a consistent line of accusation. When all the collected evidence began to add up to a single picture, Detective James O'Reilly decided that it was time for a deeper interrogation of Lisa Martin. He understood that with each new step, the evidence increasingly pointed to her involvement in the murder. Now it was necessary not only to confirm the suspicions, but also to find out the motive that led her to such a cruel act. Lisa Martin was summoned to the police station to provide further statements. O'Reilly, a detective she already knew well, greeted her with a calm expression on his face. He started with more general questions, gradually moving on to clarifying details, trying to win her over to frankness. Lisa looked tired, but remained outwardly calm. She recounted the events of that day as if she had memorized them in advance, the usual routine actions, the visit to the therapist, and the return home. However, as the interrogation continued, Lisa's calm began to crumble. O'Reilly's questions became increasingly specific, drawing attention to inconsistencies in her testimony. Soon, Lisa began to get nervous, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve and avoiding direct gaze. Pauses and inconsistencies began to appear in her story. When the detective confronted her with evidence collected from the crime scene, including surveillance footage that didn't match her account, her face paled. Detectives were especially drawn to the traces of blood on her shoes, as well as internet requests for ways to cover up crimes. With each new fact, Lisa became more and more withdrawn into herself. Her confidence evaporated. Her answers became confused. She fell silent more and more often, thinking about how to get out of the current situation. When the detectives presented Lisa with more significant evidence, such as confession files found on the computer, her nerves finally gave way. Lisa began to lose control of herself. Her hands began to tremble. At some point, she realized that there was no point in resisting anymore. Lisa began to tell how everything happened on that fateful evening. Emma told her that she was going to leave the house, which sent Lisa into a state of panic. During the quarrel, she grabbed a knife and in a fit of rage dealt fatal blows. Her story was confusing and emotionally charged. She admitted how she tried to cover up the crime by using purchased cleaning products and trying to fake Emma's disappearance. With each new word, her voice became quieter, until, finally, Lisa realized that she had said everything she could. The interrogation lasted several hours, after which Lisa Martin was arrested and charged with murder. Her condition was close to a nervous breakdown, but she no longer resisted. She understood that now she was awaiting trial, and all her attempts to hide the truth were in vain. For Detective O'Reilly and his team, this was an important step in the investigation. They received a confession, but there was still work ahead to complete the case, collect the remaining evidence, and prepare for the trial. Now that the main suspect has been arrested, the investigation has moved to a new stage. Following the arrest of Lisa Martin, Detective James O'Reilly and his team focused their efforts on determining the motive for the murder. Lisa's confession made it clear that the murder had occurred in a fit of rage, but detectives felt there was something deeper behind the action. They needed to understand what emotions and circumstances led to such a tragic outcome. One of the first tasks was to study Lisa's psychological state. A team of detectives contacted her therapist to gain access to medical records and counseling she had undergone in recent months. These recordings could shed light on Lisa's internal struggle, her anxieties and fears. Dr. Elizabeth Jones, Lisa's psychotherapist, provided investigators with session reports detailing her condition. The records showed that Lisa suffered from chronic depression and had serious problems controlling her emotions. She often spoke of her attachment to Emma, which over time turned into an unhealthy obsession. Lisa felt that she was losing control over Emma's life, that she was gradually moving away, and this frightened her. As Emma grew older, her desire to become independent increased, which left Lisa with feelings of betrayal and despair. Lisa increasingly expressed fear during the sessions that she might lose Emma, and this feeling became unbearable for her. One of the most disturbing parts of the report were the session notes, where Lisa mentioned thoughts of violence. She admitted that sometimes, in a fit of anger and despair, she imagined how she could harm Emma. However, she always maintained that these thoughts remained only fantasies and that she could never do such a thing in real life. However, these recordings played a key role in understanding her psychological state and how it could lead to tragedy. Detectives also examined Lisa's correspondence found on her computer. The letters she wrote to Emma reflected her emotional state and growing tension. At first, they were full of love and care, but over time they became more and more jealous and aggressive. Lisa often accused Emma of not paying enough attention to her, making new acquaintances, and becoming more independent. These letters became increasingly aggressive, even threatening to leave Emma alone if she decided to leave. An important discovery was a letter that Lisa wrote the night before the murder, but never sent. In this letter, she openly expressed her fears and pain associated with the possible loss of Emma. She wrote about her fear of being alone, how jealous she was, and how she couldn't live without Emma. This letter became a kind of dying confession, revealing the full depth of her despair and emotional instability. In parallel with the study of psychological aspects, detectives continued to study Lisa's financial activity. They discovered that a few weeks before the murder, Lisa took out a large loan, explaining that it was necessary to repair the house. However, this money was transferred to closed accounts, and its further use could not be traced. The discovery led detectives to speculate about possible other motives behind the crime, perhaps related to money or debt. O'Reilly's team also studied Lisa and Emma's social connections. It was revealed that in recent months, Emma had been increasingly communicating with new people, including one young man who showed special interest in her. Lisa, according to friends, was jealous of Emma towards all her new friends and acquaintances. Detectives interviewed this young man, and although he was not directly connected to the murder, his testimony confirmed that Emma did indeed plan to leave Lisa and start an independent life. All these facts gradually added up to a picture showing that Lisa could not come to terms with the fact that she was losing control over Emma's life. Her fear of being alone, of losing the one she considered her only close soul, brought her to the edge of an emotional abyss. The murder was a final act of desperation when Lisa realized she could no longer keep Emma by her side. The investigation also revealed that Lisa carefully planned her actions after the murder. She studied in advance ways to hide traces, bought the necessary materials, and thought through an alibi. However, her plan did not work as her emotional instability and spontaneous actions ultimately led to her exposure. The motive analysis culminated in detectives preparing a detailed report that would form the basis of the charges. This report included a psychological portrait of Lisa, her correspondence, financial transactions, and testimonies of loved ones. All of these elements indicated that the murder was the result not only of emotional instability, but also of deep-rooted fears that Lisa was unable to overcome. Now that all the basic facts had been collected and analyzed, the investigation had reached the point where it was time to prepare for trial. O'Reilly's team knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but the main puzzle was complete, and the motive for the crime became clear. The completion of the investigation was marked by the final steps aimed at confirming the investigation's version and preparing the case for transfer to court. After carefully analyzing the motive, Detective James O'Reilly and his team decided to act quickly and decisively to bring closure to the case and bring justice to Emma. First of all, investigators focused on the final collection of all evidence that could confirm Lisa Martin's guilt. It was decided to conduct a second search of her house to find additional evidence that could support the accusation. The search revealed several new details that had previously gone unnoticed. In one of the secret niches in the basement, photographs of Emma were found, taken in secret, without her knowledge. These photographs demonstrated Lisa's obsession with her adopted daughter, further supporting the investigation's version. In addition, old letters from Lisa to Emma were discovered, which she kept as trophies of their relationship. These letters, written with deep emotional anguish, revealed her thoughts and fears, which increasingly captured her consciousness. In them, Lisa openly expressed her jealousy and fear of losing Emma, which ultimately led to tragic events. In parallel with this, detectives completed an analysis of Lisa's financial activities. It was established that the money she transferred to closed accounts was used to pay for consultations with private investigators whom she hired to spy on Emma. This discovery once again confirmed how far Lisa was willing to go to maintain control over her adopted daughter's life. With new evidence obtained and Lisa's full confession, Detective O'Reilly and his team began preparations for her arrest. They understood that any wrong step could complicate the case in court, so they acted with extreme caution. Lisa remained under police surveillance to avoid a possible escape attempt. The arrest was carried out early in the morning when Lisa was at home. The police entered the house, already prepared for possible resistance, but Lisa did not offer any resistance. Her morale was on edge, and she seemed to have already accepted her fate. She was led out of the house in handcuffs and silently allowed the police to do their job. At the station, Lisa was officially charged with first-degree murder. She showed no emotion when her rights were read to her. At that moment, she already realized that her life was ruined, and only inevitable punishment awaited her ahead. Her lawyer tried to find mitigating circumstances by appealing to her psychological state, but there was too much evidence and confessions to build a successful defense. The trial began several months after the arrest, and it attracted a lot of public attention. The Lisa Martin case has become emblematic of the tragedy caused by the combination of mental instability and destructive attachments. The prosecution presented a complete dossier of evidence, including Lisa's correspondence, financial transactions, as well as her confessions made during interrogation. At the trial, letters were read in which Lisa admitted her fears and jealousy, which became the key point in the accusation. Forensic experts who examined Lisa's psychological profile confirmed that she was in a state of deep emotional crisis, which led her to irreversible actions. However, this could not justify her action in the eyes of the court. Testimony from witnesses, including friends and neighbors, also played an important role in the case. They talked about the difficult relationship between Lisa and Emma, about the frequent quarrels and suspicions that hovered around this family. This evidence confirmed that the conflict between them had been brewing for a long time and reached its peak at the time of the murder. After several weeks of hearings and deliberations, the jury returned a verdict. Lisa Martin was found guilty of premeditated murder of her adopted daughter. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This verdict was the result of a long and complex investigation, which revealed the dark sides of the human psyche and led to fair punishment. Following the verdict, Detective O'Reilly and his team felt satisfied that justice had been achieved for Emma. However, the case left a deep imprint on their souls, reminding them of how far people can go when they are trapped by their fears and emotional attachments. The investigation has ended, but its consequences will remain in the memory of all who were involved. Lisa Martin's life was forever changed, and Emma, whose life was so tragically cut short, remains in everyone's memory as a victim of circumstances that no one could prevent. After the trial ended, life in the quiet town of Boulder, Colorado, began to slowly return to normal. However, the story of Lisa Martin and Emma Smith left a deep imprint in the memory of residents, becoming one of the most discussed tragedies in recent years. People continued to discuss the story, drawing their own conclusions and speculating about how something like this could happen in their society. Detective James O'Reilly, having completed his last major investigation, remained in the shadow of this case for a long time. Working on it turned out to be not only a professional challenge for him, but also a personal test. He often thought back to the events that led to this tragedy, analyzing every detail, every decision to understand whether this catastrophe could have been prevented. O'Reilly began to notice that the Lisa Martin case was a reminder of how important detective work is in finding the truth. He realized that despite the weight of the moral burden that he carried, he managed to achieve justice for Emma. The case made him think about the fine line between love and obsession, and how easy it is to lose control when emotions take over reason. Meanwhile, questions began to arise in the city about how similar incidents could be prevented in the future. Guardianship authorities and social services, having learned about the tragedy, initiated a review of procedures for monitoring foster families in order to avoid the recurrence of such cases. New rules and standards have been introduced to assess the psychological state of adoptive parents, especially in cases where signs of emotional instability arise. Lisa and Emma's story has also sparked widespread public debate about the importance of mental health and the need to seek help early in problems. Psychologists and psychotherapists have begun to actively discuss issues related to emotional attachment and the possible risks it can carry if not controlled. The city even organized a series of lectures and workshops for parents and caregivers to raise awareness of the possible consequences of unhealthy emotional relationships. All this time, the house where the tragedy occurred stood empty. Its dark windows and abandoned appearance became a reminder to all residents of what happened. Some neighbors said that at night they thought they heard echoes of the quarrels and screams that were heard there in the last days of Emma's life. People began to avoid the house, and some even suggested demolishing it in order to erase this painful memory from the face of the city. However, despite the gravity of this story, there was also an important message. She reminded people to be considerate of each other, especially when it comes to the emotional well-being of loved ones. Many have begun to pay more attention to their relationships, trying to notice warning signs that may indicate problems, and not being afraid to seek help. Detective O'Reilly, having completed his work on the case, decided to take a vacation. He understood that he needed time to comprehend everything that had happened and regain his strength. The time spent away from work helped him find inner balance and return to normal life. But even after his vacation, the Lisa Martin case remained in his memory as one of the most difficult he had encountered in his career. Time passed, and the city of Boulder began to heal its wounds. Life went on as usual, but the story of Lisa and Emma remained in the memory as a warning about how love, which has lost its boundaries, can turn into a destructive force. This case forever changed the approach to psychological support in the city and became an important lesson for everyone who learned about it. Ultimately, this case became not just a tragic story, but also a reason for reflection on the importance of care, attention, and awareness in relationships. Boulder residents will remember this story for a long time to come, as a reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets lie behind the most ordinary facades.